It's already hard as it is to present in your first language. Whether that language happens to be English, French, German, Urdu, Hindi, Mandarin, Italian, you name it, right? But what happens when you need to present in a second language or even a third? That's when things get a lot more challenging, like it was for me, since I speak three languages, right? So, how do we make our lives easier so that the next time you give a presentation in a second or third language, that you give an excellent one? And that's exactly what we're covering this week's episode of Master Talk. Hi everyone, I hope you're having a fantastic week. Brendan here from MasterTalk, your go-to channel to mastering your talk. And on this week's episode, we're covering some practical tips and tricks to making sure that the next time you give a presentation in either your second or third language, you give an excellent one, so that you're not worried about not giving a presentation in what you're usually comfortable with. So let's get into it. Number one. The number one thing I recommend to people who are presenting in a language they're not entirely familiar with, but they can speak very well in it, so second or third language, is to write out your speech from A to Z in your first language. So let's explain why I believe this is a really good tip. And a lot of you can relate to this and you'll understand this very well. Generally, your first language is very different from your second or third. And the big differences between the two is your ability to use vocabulary as a way to make your presentation sound better. So I'll give you an example. Because English is my first language, it's very easy for me to use the right words to explain exactly what I mean, but also in a way to get my audience excited. So for example, my case competition quote that I love to use, Amit Kalandri's quote that goes like this: if you fulfill the wishes of your employees, they in turn will fulfill your vision. See, that sounds amazing in English, but in French or Tamil, the other languages that I speak, it's not so clean, it's not as phonetically correct, right? Or sounds good, essentially. But that also applies with your second and third language. So for example, let's say you try and deliver that same language or that same quote or that same sentence in a different language. It's a lot harder for you to do that if you don't know where that sentence comes from. So I think it's much easier for you to write out your pitch, let's say in English in my case. So let's say I'm giving a French presentation. Then I would translate that English text into French. So that way, as I'm changing it, I can see if some sentences make sense and some don't. For example, in the case of the quote, I might need to change the quote, right? Because it doesn't sound as good as it is in French. Obviously, I won't do the translation here, since many of you might not understand it. But the point is, it's much more difficult to do so. Which brings me to my second point. Once you've done this translation, you've spent a long time, crafting the presentation in the way you want to in your first language, the way you intended to, and now you translate into a language you need to speak it in. Once you've done this, now you need to do what I like to call a vocabulary boost. So what you need to do is to get the worst critics that you have, but that speak the native tongue of what you're going to be presenting. So the native language, essentially. So let's say in my case, because the presentation, let's say, is going to be in French, my second language, I am going to present my presentation not just to critics that I know who are really good at English, but only to critics I know that are really good at French, where French is their first language. Because they'll be able to find the big differences between how I'm presenting the content in my second language and how it sounds to them, because it's more intuitive for them. So for example, there's going to be several sentences in my pitch that I translated from English that they're going to look at me and say, Brendan, this doesn't sound that great. I would use that instead. And that's what's great about your critics. They're not going to just criticize you, but they're also going to recommend ways to change it. And this is the reason why I recommend this, is because I don't want you to spend a couple of hours trying to figure out what sounds nice. Just ask your audience. Because chances are, if your critics speak French and it's their first language, in my case anyways, and you're presenting to a group whose first language is French, coincidentally, whatever doesn't sound right with them won't sound right with the audience you're presenting to. So in that regard, by not memorizing, but rather writing out your speech in the language you're comfortable with, translating that and vetting that by vocabulary boosters, essentially, so people whose first language is the one you're going to present in, you'll be able to really boost up your text, the vocabulary that you're using, so that you can give a more enriching, amazing, and great presentation. Which brings me to my last point. This one's going to be interesting. There's two parts to this. My third tip is simple. Don't memorize, mesmerize. See how nice that sounds in English? On a side note, wouldn't sound so great in French, but let's get into it. The point I want to drive here is if it's your first time or first couple of times presenting in a language that you're not familiar with entirely, like in my case with French, you can totally memorize, okay? I know this is counterintuitive. I know a lot of people will hate me for this. This is just the truth, okay? If you're presenting a language you're not comfortable with, you need to memorize because I want you to be in a situation where you're actually presenting something that people understand rather than you like panicking on stage. That's the last thing I want. But this is where I want to change to the second part now. Once you get really good at it, similar to training wheels you put on when you're trying to ride a bike for the first time, you don't need them anymore. Once it's your 4th, 5th, 6th, 10th time presenting in that second language, now I want you to stop memorizing and go back to the tips that I generally recommend on MasterTalk. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. So in that regard, I want you to start by memorizing because that's what I did. When I was in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, I memorized all of my presentations in French. It's just what I did. I didn't know the language that well. I needed to master it, right? But then after I got more comfortable, I can do a bit more improvisation. I can be a lot more creative. But even to this day, I still write out my speeches from A to Z in my second language. I never do that in English, but I always do in French to make sure my vocabulary is straight. I know presenting in a second language is tough, and to some, a third language even harder. But at the end of the day, I believe that if you follow this unconventional advice, even if it sounds weird, why am I writing out my speech? I never usually do that. Hear me out, try it out, because it worked for me. And then through that, not only will you be able to remove those training wheels and become more comfortable presenting in their language, but you'll also understand the intuitive nature of that language through the worst critics that are giving you feedback, and you'll be not 1, not 2, but 10 steps closer to mastering your talk. Because I guarantee you, if you can present in a second language very well, when you go back to your first language, you're going to be a superstar. So don't worry about it, and keep at it. If you enjoyed this week's episode of Master Talk, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well to see more videos like this. And if there's anything that you take away from this video, it's this. Mastering a second or third language and specifically presenting it is tough. But if you can master that, I believe you'll be 10 steps closer to mastering your talk. Be sure to send this video to someone who's struggling in presenting in a second or third language so that you can help them master their talk as well. Take care, everyone. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.